Hello and welcome back to Bookish. I'm here with what I think is a really special tag called the Amplify Voices tag. Black Lives Matter. It was created by Jennie Johnson. I'll leave a link over to her original video in the show notes down below. And essentially what she's done is she's challenging white booktubers to share African American voices, either to read a passage from a book written by an African American author, or an essay, or a poem. And the idea here is, I believe, for white booktubers to lift up the voices of African American people and creators, and as a way of showing our support, but also I think as a way of educating ourselves and trying to spread education of others about the reality of racism and racist violence and the history of that in the United States. This is a subject that is important to me and has been for quite some time. I realize there are people out there who are going to just say that this is virtue signaling. I'd rather be accused of virtue signaling than of silence and of giving silent consent to continued racism. So you can judge this however you see fit, in whatever way you see fit. But the idea here is that white booktubers are going to read works of African American authors in an attempt to make those works more widely known, and the ideas and the reality behind those works more widely known. So at the end, I'm going to tag 5 white booktubers to carry on and pick up the challenge. So I chose a poem by one of my favorite living poets, and that's Nikki Giovanni. Nikki Giovanni was born in Knoxville, Tennessee, sometime in the mid-40s, which meant that she was a young adult during the civil rights movement and the activities of the 1960s, and she was certainly active. Her poetry speaks to her experience, the African American experience in the United States, the history of violence and racism. It reflects the growth of the Black Pride movement. One of my favorite poems by her is called Ego Trippin', which I just love. She went toe-to-toe with James Baldwin. She challenged expectations and continued to throughout her own life. She could be a critic of African American leaders. Most notably, she was willing to take Barack Obama to task for what she believed to be his shortcomings as the first African American president. Even though she loved him and supported him, she wasn't afraid to tell what she believed was the truth on him. And I just really love and admire Nikki Giovanni, and I like her work. So the poem I chose to share with you is called Rosa Parks. And if there is a name that I think is more as synonymous with the civil rights movement as Martin Luther King Jr.'s name in the United States of America, it may be Rosa Parks. So I'm going to try to read this poem. It's the first time I've done like a reading, I think, where you can see me. I'm going to try to read this poem. I'm bound to make mistakes, and I'm hoping my dogs don't bark in the middle. If I do, there'll be an edit. But I want to read this poem because, being a history person, I think it does such a great job of showing how the moments of the civil rights movement, some that people know about and some that don't, are all connected, and one thing builds and leads to another. And I think that's important because I think and hope we're on the verge of change as a result of that. So here we go, Rosa Parks by Nikki Giovanni. This is for the Pullman porters who organized when people said they couldn't, and carried the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender to the black Americans in the South so they would know they were not alone. This is for the Pullman porters who helped Thurgood Marshall go south and come back north to fight the fight that resulted in Brown versus Board of Education, because even though Kansas is west, and even though Topeka is the birthplace of Gwendolyn Brooks, who wrote the powerful The Chicago Defender Sends a Man to Little Rock, it was the Pullman porters who whispered to the traveling men, both the blues men and the race men, so that they would both know what was going on. This is for the Pullman porters who smiled as if they were happy and laughed like they were tickled when some folks were around, and who silently rejoiced in 1954 when the Supreme Court announced its 9-0 decision that separate is inherently unequal. This is for the Pullman porters who smiled and welcomed a 14-year-old boy onto their train in 1955. They noticed his slight limp that he tried to disguise with a doo-wop walk. They noticed his stutter and probably understood why his mother wanted him out of Chicago during the summer when school was out. 14-year-old black boys with limps and stutters are apt to try to prove themselves in dangerous ways when mothers aren't around to look after them. So this is for the Pullman porters who looked over that 14-year-old while the train rolled the reverse of the blues highways from Chicago to St. Louis to Memphis to Mississippi. This is for the men who kept him safe. And if Emmett Till had been able to stay on the train all summer, he would have maybe grown a bit of a paunch, certainly lost his hair, probably have worn bifocals and bounced his grandchildren on his knee, telling him about his summer riding the rails. But he had to get off the train and ended up in Money, Mississippi, and was horribly, brutally, inexcusably, and unacceptably murdered. This is for the Pullman porters who, when the sheriff was trying to get the body secretly buried, got Emmett's body on the northbound train, got his body home to Chicago where his mother said, "I want the world to see what they did to my boy." And this is for all the mothers who cried. And this is for all the people who said never again. And this is about Rosa Parks, whose feet were not so tired. It had been, after all, an ordinary day, until the bus driver gave her the opportunity to make history. This is about Mrs. Rosa Parks from Tuskegee, Alabama, who was also the field secretary of the NAACP. This is about the moment Rosa Parks shouldered her cross, put her worldly goods aside, was willing to sacrifice her life so that that young man in Money, Mississippi, who had been so well protected by the Pullman porters, would not have died in vain. When Mrs. Parks said no, a passionate movement began. No longer would there be reliance on the law. There was a higher law. When Mrs. Parks brought that light of hers to expose the evil of the system, the sun came and rested on her shoulders, bringing the heat and the light of truth. Others would follow Mrs. Parks. 4 young men in Greensboro, North Carolina would say no. Great voices would be raised singing the praises of God and exhorting us to forgive those who trespass against us. But it was the Pullman porters who safely got Emmett to his granduncle, and it was Mrs. Rosa Parks who could not stand that death, and in not being able to stand it, she sat back down. So I'm going to leave the list of the people that I'm tagging to do this tag in the show notes down below. Thank you for watching.